Okay, we are now recording. Okay, today we're going to be talking about the two great awakenings that we've referred to, and then we're going to eventually get to the Restoration movement, or sometimes called the Stone Campbell movement, that involves some of our own spiritual ancestors in our movement. We'll also take one little side trip to give you some ideas of a couple of things happening in the Catholic Church during the last 2 centuries. But let's now look at these two major periods that we're going to be discussing: the Great Awakening in England and the American colonies, and the Second Great Awakening in the untied states. It should be the United States. Yes, they did get untied when the Civil War came along. That's not what that's supposed to say. Uh, we've talked about the Great Awakening a little bit last time. That did involve George Whitefield and John Wesley from England coming over here. And Diane did the research on that and gave us some really interesting things about those two men. And I understand that Steve and Diane are continuing to do some more study about that. But appreciate the fact that they have shared what they have with us. Then, so we'll just jump on over the First Great Awakening. Maybe just mention a couple of things here. You know, most of the universities in the United States were started by religious people. Harvard and Yale were both started for spiritual reasons. They both are pretty far from that now, but Harvard and Yale, the leaders of those two institutions, were really opposed to a lot of things going on in the Great Awakening because, as you see up here under number 3, there was a lot of emotion involved in the Great Awakening, and the preaching was very emotional. People often had a very emotional relationship with God. They got away from a lot of the formalism and the ritual, and the more intellectual folks kind of looked down on what was happening in the Great Awakening. And so they were opposed to it, and that led to the founding of Princeton, which is also now one of the Ivy League schools. But Princeton kind of held on to its spiritual basis much longer than the others did. But overall, the Great Awakening did lead to a great increase in church membership and in new groups. And we've mentioned Wesley and Whitefield, and then the colonist who became one of the leaders in the Great Awakening was Jonathan Edwards. Probably all we know for most of us about Jonathan Edwards is in high school we had to read a sermon that he preached. And it's really not fair to Jonathan Edwards. He did preach that sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. That was not typical of him. That was a little bit unusual, that particular sermon. But it's kind of like Bill Buckner with the Boston Red Sox. All he's remembered for is that the ball went through his legs and allowed Mookie Betts for the Mets to score, and the Red Sox went on to lose the World Series. And Bill Buckner was really a great player, but that's all anybody remembers about him. Well, that in the case of Jonathan Edwards, similar thing. He preached that one sermon about sinners in the hands of an angry God, and that got in every textbook, particularly in our era. In a lot of ways, people feel like the Great Awakening did sort of prepare the way for the revolution of 1776. And that's kind of complicated to explain. But one thing you can say is that during the Great Awakening, they weren't emphasizing the idea of Christians not fighting in wars, as had been emphasized in the early church and would be emphasized later on, but it was connected with the revolution in a way that kind of gave fuel to it, particularly among the Presbyterians that we've alluded to earlier. Okay, let's go on to the Second Great Awakening. This one occurs after the United States is formed, and we're into the 1820s when the Second Great Awakening begins. It had its beginnings in rural America, and one of the things that fueled this movement were camp meetings. Now, if you want to think about the conferences we often go to, and we have a big one coming up in Orlando that may or may not happen. It's looking more and more like it may not happen. But these camp meetings were something comparable to the kind of conferences we have. People would travel long distances, and they would set up camp, and they would find a big open area where they could meet, and they would have preaching for sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days. If the Holy Spirit seemed to be moving to the leaders, they would just keep the camp meeting going. And sometimes they would go on for 2 weeks. And you come away from that experience with a term called protracted meetings. And so when I was growing up in the Restoration movement, Churches of Christ, we would have protracted meetings, and we would have a visiting evangelist come in, and he would maybe preach for 7 straight nights. I actually conducted a protracted meeting in my grandfather's hometown of Waterloo, Alabama. I can't remember. I think I only spoke for like 5 nights in a row, something like that. But that was the kind of experience that occurred in Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801 that was kind of a launching point for the Restoration movement. We're going to get into much more as we go along. But again, much like the First Great Awakening, the preaching would often be emotional. I've heard some of that kind of preaching, and it would be strongly Arminian. Now, we've noticed that Whitefield was strongly Calvinistic. Wesley was strongly Arminian. By the time of the Second Great Awakening, most of the preaching was tending in the Arminian direction, away from the Calvinist influence. And one name kind of stands out among all the others, Charles Finney. He was a great orator, but understood the use of emotion. And so he had huge services in which many people felt they had a conversion experience. And so conversion was kind of a key word. Number 7 there talks about the protracted meetings that I got into a little earlier. But many people saw it as an exceptional time of God pouring out his Spirit, pouring out his grace. And it was really during this time that the whole idea of America as God's Christian nation really began to form in a strong way, and would become a concept that would still be even influential today. You still have people who refer to America as a Christian nation. When we really get into the scriptures, you really learn that there is no Christian nation. There may be countries that allow spirituality to be involved in the public square more than other places, but there is no longer a nation like the Jews were God's nation. There's no longer a nation like that. That in the New Testament, that's the church. The church has now become God's holy people, and Christian and nations don't exist. But that concept began to develop in this period. Now, just a little side trip down the road of the Catholic Church here for a moment. We won't try to go into any great detail. The Catholic Church hasn't changed a great deal in the last couple of hundred years, but there were two major councils that were similar to the ecumenical councils that we discussed way back in the fourth century, back at the time of Augustine. The first ecumenical council, you may remember, was called by Constantine, but there were two in the last 200 years that have been quite influential in Catholicism. The first one was called Vatican I. Well, it was just called the Vatican Council, and then later on, when they held Vatican II, uh, then they had to go back and call the first one Vatican I, much like World War I and World War II. World War I wasn't called World War I while it was being fought. It was called the Great War. And then when World War II began, you changed the nomenclature for World War I. You went back and renamed it, with the number one. The First Vatican Council, which was held back in 1869, on American time, that's a little bit after the Civil War, but it very carefully defined the primacy of the Pope and established very clearly papal infallibility. And that's still, even in the Catholic Church, a kind of a controversial idea. It's misunderstood by both people in the Catholic Church and people outside it. It doesn't mean that everything the Pope does or everything the Pope says is an infallible statement. You don't have infallible statements that are made except being very carefully vetted by the College of Cardinals that serves around the Pope. And there have been only two of those statements that have ever been made. One of them occurred here in Vatican I, and the second one was occurred in 1950 when Pope Pius XII made a declaration that Mary never actually died, but that she, maybe like some Old Testament characters, were bodily assumed into heaven. That concept had been developing over many, many years, many decades, and finally in 1950, Pope Pius made the second, quote unquote, infallible statement that Mary was bodily assumed into heaven. The first one was made about the infallibility of the Pope and referred to something that had been stated pretty clearly as a strong church canon law, and that was that Mary also had an immaculate conception. When you see the signs on a church calling a church the Church of the Immaculate Conception, many of us think that refers to Jesus, but Mary also was declared by the Catholic Church to have had an immaculate conception. Somebody just came on. I think you muted yourself just in time. Somebody just came in with a lot of feedback, so I need you to mute your microphone. I probably can't see all the lists, how to do that for you. So anyway, the concept of papal infallibility was established. The Catholics use the term when the Pope speaks ex cathedra. It's a Latin phrase that means from the chair. And so whenever there's an infallible doctrine that's declared, and like I say, it's only been done twice, the Pope will go to his throne and sit in his chair and declare it from there. And again, that's after a lot of careful vetting by the College of Cardinals. Okay, the Second Vatican Council occurred in the 1960s, 62 to 65. And of course, those are the years I was finishing up high school. And even though it probably would have been in the news a great deal, I never knew anything about it. I was totally out of touch with anything going on in church history, or particularly in the Catholic Church. But it went on for 3 years with the cardinals meeting at the Vatican in Rome. And so when I got to graduate school in 1969, one of the first books I was asked to read in a theology class were the documents of Vatican II. It was a pretty thick book, and all of these papers, kind of theme papers, theses, were written to let the Catholic Church know and the outside world know what had been decided. And some of these documents are actually quite good. One of them on the function of the body of Christ. You would read through it and you would find many biblical references in it, and what the purpose of the body of Christ is. Really, really some well done documents. Overall, the documents that came out of Vatican II were interpreted, and there's a little controversy in the Catholic Church about this, but they were interpreted by most people to say the Catholic Church is now open to the idea that other believers are also Christians. For a long time, there'd been kind of an understanding by the majority of Catholics that unless you were in communion in the Catholic Church, were able to come to communion, be a part of it, only if you were doing those things were you really in the grace of God and the favor of God. But they recognized in Vatican II that there were other sincere believers outside of them. They tried to still make it clear that the Catholic Church was truly God's church, but that there were others who could have a relationship with God also. One of the things that came out of Vatican II was that it ended up with the clergy, and particularly the Pope and the cardinals, bishops, being far less authoritarian. Now, there were those who took a very liberal view of the council, of what it decided. And these folks sometimes went to some, in the mind of some conservative Catholics, went to some extreme liberal views. And they ended up being rebuked or condemned by the church if they took things too far. That's really all I want to say about Catholicism. I want to come back now to things that are a little closer to home for us. And so we're talking about the 1800s. And so there are several things here to remember about that century, the 19th century. For one thing, you really even saw more than that had happened already. You saw the proliferation of denominations. So there were lots more splits and a lot more branches kind of on that tree we've looked at several times in documents. And the sectarian discord could often be very harsh. Presbyterians condemning the Methodists, Methodists condemning the Baptists, so forth, just back and forth, because there was this American idea of independence and freedom. And so if we don't like what they're teaching here in this church, we just start our own church. And so that happened numerous times. We looked at that diagram a few weeks ago showing how the Presbyterians split split many times, and it happened in many other groups as well. And then the third thing would be that the Great Awakening did occur, and the Great Awakening did have a unifying effect because it was kind of across these different sectarian groups that it occurred. And so it was seen as the Holy Spirit kind of working to kind of pull others back together. But it was also during this time, and this wouldn't usually be listed as a fourth major thing, but for our purposes, I do want to mention that the beginning of the Restoration movement occurred during the Second Great Awakening. You know, we said that camp meeting at Cane Ridge, Kentucky occurred, and Barton W. Stone was at that camp meeting. He was one of the speakers at that camp meeting. And then he would become one of the two major leaders of the Restoration movement. I'll touch on this later on, but the movement that starts here, this Restoration movement, wasn't called the Restoration originally. It borrowed from several centuries earlier and was self-described as another Reformation. So you'll find in the writings of Campbell and Stone and some of those other leaders in this referring to this Reformation movement that we're a part of. It was only later that the idea of the restoration sort of, we want to restore first century Christianity. We want to restore the early church. That language begins to be used later on. But eventually, by the end of this century, by the time the century turns over from the 19th to the 20th century, we get into the 1900s, this movement will be the largest indigenous religious movement in the United States. You see, the other groups were brought to the United States from England. The Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterian, they all came over. The Puritans, which became the Congregationalists, they all came over from England. But this was a new movement, and so it became the largest movement that was indigenous, that came itself from the United States. Now, another movement would later surpass the Restoration movement in size. And I wonder if you know what that movement is. Does anybody want to open your mic and take a guess at another indigenous movement to the United States that later on greatly outgrows the Restoration movement, the Churches of Christ and the Christian churches? That would be the Mormons. Mormonism is an indigenous movement. It began with the revelations to Joseph Smith, and then Joseph Smith gets run out of the Northeast and ends up in Illinois and gets run out of there, and the Mormons make their trek across the country all the way until they find their promised land in Utah, and they establish their base there in Salt Lake City. And then they will later on far outgrow the Restoration movement. Okay, so let's look at this idea of Reformation and Restoration. If you're able to see the screen right now, what we're trying to illustrate here is the idea of the Reformation. Luther recognized that the Catholic Church had gone down many wrong roads and had invented, come up with, evolved to many doctrines that weren't biblical. But eventually people would look and see that they felt like what Luther and Calvin did was take it back to about the time of Augustine, that they didn't go far enough back. They didn't go all the way back to the first century. They didn't go back to the New Testament church. And so if this is Reformation, what you see on the screen here, going back to Augustine, then here is what restoration is all about. See, the idea is you stretch the curve back further. We're talking a lot about flattening the curve today, but this is stretching the curve, that you want to stretch it all the way back to the New Testament. Can't we just go back to a time when there weren't Baptists, Methodists, Catholics, uh, Orthodox? Can't we just go back to a time when the church was simple, just simply be Christians? That's the idea of restoration. Now, the Anabaptists, 300 years earlier, had talked about that as well, and that's what they were trying to do. And there were some groups in England that were talking about this, and so we think of it as often originating in America, and for the most part it did, but there were some groups back in England that were already kind of talking about this. Now, there were two motivating concerns with this movement. First of all was the unity of the sects. They felt like that it was, they read 1 Corinthians 1, some people say, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, and Paul condemns that kind of denominating of yourself. Uh, Paul wants it emphasized, you weren't baptized in the name of Paul. It's not about Paul, it's not about Cephas, it's not about Apollos, it's all about Jesus. And so the goal was to get back to that kind of unity. As you can see, the idea of kind of breaking off into different sects or groups that follow different people is an old idea. It started at least in Corinth, and may have been earlier than that. But then the other idea ends up being restoring the primitive church. Now, what's eventually going to happen in the restoration movement is that one group is going to pick the unity side of things, and the other group is going to pick the restoring side of things. And so our particular movement grows out of this group that puts the emphasis on restoration. They began trying to emphasize both of these ideas. They found it very difficult to keep the two of them together. The challenge of unity was to unite without just sort of becoming compromising, so you just didn't have convictions about a lot of things. The challenge of restoration, and this is still a challenge of restoration, is to determine what's essential and what's non-essential. What kind of things happened in the early church that were just sort of incidental to the circumstances they lived in? What kind of things were more cultural? And what kind of things were essential? We'll see that the idea of restoration often involves seeing the New Testament as a blueprint or a pattern of what the church is supposed to look like. And then, though, that became challenging because one group would see a pattern in the New Testament, and the other group said that's not really a pattern. That just was what happened in that culture. That's not one of the essential things that we need to keep our eyes on. You can't see it happen here, but I just spilled water all over my computer. I should drink it instead of sloshing it around. Okay, I'm going to skip this one because I need to finish up a couple things. Well, my wife's coming in to help me wipe my computer off. You'll just get me a paper towel, or those will work right there. A couple of those. Okay, I mentioned that the whole restoration idea had some beginnings back in England, but it really wouldn't get started in a major way. Thank you. Until it began here in the United States. So these are some people you could look up sometime. I'm having strange things. I don't know if it's because I was rubbing my computer, trying to get the water off of it. There we go. Okay. Uh, there was a guy named Sandelman who planted some churches with these ideas, uh, emphasizing weekly Lord's Supper. Uh, there was a group in Scotland that met for a while with the name of the Church of Christ with the goal of restoring the New Testament church. Uh, there was actually a meeting that was influenced by Alexander Campbell, who would come to the United States and begin emphasizing these ideas. There were various journals published, including one that was called the British Millennial Harbinger. Alexander Campbell would begin a publication here in the United States that he would call the Millennial Harbinger. Well, eventually, after he did that here, there was somebody who began publishing one called the British Millennial Harbinger. Okay, well, let's just look at a couple of maps here for a minute that show us that here in the United States, there were several sources of this restoration idea and this unity movement. One of the sources was the Christian Connection Group up in New England. Another group under the influence of Alexander Campbell and his father, Thomas Campbell, in Pennsylvania and in West Virginia. They would call themselves simply disciples of Christ. And in that sense, they have something in common with us, a term we like to emphasize. Then over in Kentucky and in the Carolinas, about the same time, there was this other group led by Barton W. Stone, who's the guy I said was at the Cane Ridge meeting in 1801. Stone, who also, like Campbell, came from a Presbyterian background, he would be pulling together a group of people, and they preferred to just call themselves Christians. One of the mottos that comes later out of the movement is we're not saying we're not saying we're the only Christians. We're just saying we are Christians only. And that's still kind of a sentiment that I think it's not bad to have. But then over in South Carolina, there was another group led by some guys named James O'Kelly and another fellow named Rice Haggard. And they played around with some different names. They at first called themselves Republican Methodist. Probably a little bit hard to find a Republican Methodist these days, but they use that terminology to kind of emphasize their freedom. The word Republican was used in a non-partisan way back in those times, but they also kind of preferred the term Christians. Well, at first, none of these groups knew anything about the other. They obviously didn't have the internet. They didn't even have a telegraph in those days. And it took traveling around to begin to hear about these groups. And all of these groups kind of expanded over time. And eventually they do begin to hear about each other. And Alexander Campbell makes a trip out to Kentucky to meet with Barton W. Stone. Stone had heard about Campbell. They both felt like they were probably moving in some similar directions. Somebody would come in and say, wow, you're saying some things very much like what I heard somebody saying over in Pennsylvania or over in West Virginia. And the word started getting around, and so eventually they began to have some meetings together. And so it was about 1832 or so. See, Stone starts off in about 1801. Campbell, we'll look at Campbell's dates here in just a moment, but he comes over after that, and they begin to, get in touch with each other. And so this movement begins to form. Here's some more details that probably we just don't have time to go into today. There were some New England roots. And one of the things that all of these groups had in common is they all rejected Calvinism. They all had studied some of the strong doctrines of predestination, and God ordained only certain people to be the elect, and and if you weren't ordained to be the elect, then you were automatically ordained by God to be in those that are going to be lost. Uh, and so uh, some of the people in New England broke from the Calvinist tradition that was deeply set in New England, and they sought ordination with the Free Will Baptist, where they could get away from some of those very strong Calvinistic ideas. But it's very interesting to me to move to New England and then to realize that some of the Restoration movement, which later on among churches of Christ, extremely weak in New England. One of the weakest areas of the country for churches of Christ was New England and also the Pacific Northwest. But by the time the Restoration movement evolves to the point where they're churches of Christ and Christian churches, you'd find disciples of Christ up there in the New England area, but really they weren't interested in restoration at all anymore by that point. Just the names of some other people and how they were connected. Elias Smith, he broke with the Baptist. He published his own publication for 10 years. And one of the things he did was he got hold of Thomas Stone, Barton W. Stone, last will and testament for the Springfield Presbytery. I'll have to tell you more about that here in a bit. But he published it in his publication, finding a kind of a common spirit, a like-minded person in Barton W. Stone. He actually did some traveling. He heard about James O'Kelly down in the Carolinas. He went down and sought some unity with him. It didn't turn out well, but he ended up being considered a fairly unstable person. He swung back and forth between universalism, which is the idea that everybody's going to be saved, uh, and then the more restoration idea that those that are going to be saved are those that respond to the gospel. God hasn't ordained them to be saved or lost. Now, one of the things that Smith did do is toward the end, Alexander Campbell came to Boston, and along with Tolbert Fanning, go to Lipscomb University today. Did you live in Fanning Hall? You did. You lived in which one? Not Ezel. No, there wasn't an Ezel then. I'm sorry, guys. Got distracted. My wife's come in the same room where I am right now, and we also have the lawnmower guy who's come today, and I'm very distracted at the moment. But there is a Fanning Hall at Lipscomb to this day. They've changed the names of some of them, but that hall is named after Tolbert Fanning because he was one of the Restoration leaders. So I think I'm about to stop for today. Here's some other guys that were connected with the Methodist Church down in South Carolina. Remember, Francis Asbury was sent over by John Wesley to sort of be the lead bishop for the Methodist Church in the Americas. Well, these men just didn't think it was biblical to have the authority that Francis Asbury had. And so they eventually formed that Republican Methodist Church, referring to the Free Methodists, but they're the ones who also preferred just to go by the name Christian. So you had two forces at work that were kind of getting blended together. You had the rebellion against the English ideas. So anything that was English was started to be suspect. And then the whole idea of let's just get back to the simplicity of the scriptures. So we will stop there for some questions, but next time we're going to take a look at the two main guys, Barton W. Stone from Kentucky and Alexander Campbell, that's his dad, that's Thomas Campbell, Uh, Here is Alexander down here. Uh, and so this is Thomas the dad, and this is Alexander the son. But Thomas would be very involved in the beginnings of all of this. Alexander was the thinker, and we will get into a lot of his writings and his vision. But here was basically Campbell's vision that fueled the restoration movement. If we can get people to just put away their preconceived ideas, we can get them to just sort of start as a blank slate. He'd gotten that idea from a European philosopher. Uh, then we'll all go to the Bible and we'll read the Bible and we'll all see the plan alike because it's so clear. As far as Alexander Campbell was concerned, it's so clear. And then all the sects will come together, and then God can usher in the new millennium. And somewhere in there, Jesus will be coming back. But that's where we're going. And we're going to dig in a little deeper with Stone and Campbell. I have a book back in my library. I could have brought it in here to show you. But let me put a picture up of it here. You can see that book. I think it's maybe 800 pages long, and it's a big book. It's 8.5 by 11 book, or bigger than that. But the editing on all this was finished a few years ago, led by kind of a friend of mine, Dr. Tom Albright, who taught at many years at Harding University and Abilene Christian University, and who now, interestingly enough, lives in Vermont, where some of these things began. But Tom wanted to bring together lots and lots of material about this Stone Campbell movement. So you could see we could easily teach a whole course on the Stone Campbell movement. We won't try to do that, but we will try to give more in depth than we've been doing with some of the other groups. Okay, we'll stop right there. I meant to stop earlier for some questions. So let's feel free, if you've got a question, to open up your mic. And okay, Sheila's got me laughing over here. So, okay, anybody have a comment? I hope you're still there. I can still, yeah, that's one thing I like about WebEx is I can still see your names if you're on. I couldn't do that with the last platform we were using. Okay, I know I didn't make that super clear, but does anybody have a question? Okay, let's just all open up our mics for a moment. Just go ahead and unmute yourself. Is everybody having a hard time unmuting themselves?